My father laughed when he said it, the kind of laugh meant to sound harmless, conversational, almost generous. "You'll never afford a villa like your brother's?" he announced to the guests clustered around him, lifting his champagne glass as if he had just delivered a clever punchline. The laughter that followed was polite and uneven, a ripple of sound from people who didn't know whether they were allowed to enjoy the joke, but didn't want to risk offending the host of the night. It was his retirement gala, held on the manicured grounds of my brother's new villa, all warm lighting and polished stone, and the faint smell of expensive flowers drifting through the evening air. Music played softly somewhere behind us. Servers moved through the crowd with trays of crystal glasses. Everything about the night was designed to signal success. I stood a few steps away, close enough to hear every word, far enough that no one felt the need to acknowledge me. When I turned and walked toward the gate that led into the villa itself, I wasn't trying to make a statement. I simply wanted to see the inside everyone had been praising all evening. My father stepped directly into my path. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He positioned himself squarely in front of me, blocking the entrance with the ease of a man who had spent his entire life deciding who was allowed where. The surrounding conversation slowed, then stopped. People watched. My mother leaned in close, her smile still fixed for anyone looking from a distance. "Don't embarrass us," she whispered, her voice tight and practiced. "People like you don't belong here. Know your place." I stayed silent. Not because I agreed, not because I was ashamed. I stayed silent because I knew that if I spoke, I would give them exactly what they wanted. And if I didn't, I would take something from them they didn't even realize they were about to lose. The moment passed, or at least it appeared to. My father turned back to his guests, satisfied, already resuming his role as the charming patriarch. My mother drifted away to smooth over the interruption. The music swelled again. Laughter returned, a little too loud, a little too forced. I remained exactly where I was. From the edge of the crowd, the villa looked like something out of a magazine. Tall windows glowed against the darkening sky. Stone columns framed the entrance I had just been barred from. The place was meant to impress from a distance, and it succeeded. Guests gestured toward it as if my brother had personally laid each tile, as if the structure itself were proof of his worth. My brother stood near the center of it all, accepting compliments with an easy smile. He wore the relaxed confidence of someone who had never been asked to justify his success. People told him how proud our father must be. He nodded, laughed, thanked them. He did not look in my direction once. I had learned a long time ago what my role was at gatherings like this. I was the acceptable absence, the quiet variable, the person everyone assumed would leave early, or better yet, had almost forgotten was there at all. A woman I vaguely recognized from past holidays paused beside me, glancing from me to the villa. "It's quite something," she said, as if offering me a consolation prize. "Not everyone needs a place like that to be happy." I smiled politely and said nothing. She waited, perhaps expecting me to explain myself, then shifted uncomfortably and moved on. That was the pattern. Assumptions were made, narratives were distributed. I was expected to either confirm them or disappear. Tonight, I chose the latter. As I watched the party continue, I became acutely aware of how carefully everything was being managed. My mother floated from group to group, redirecting conversations, laughing at exactly the right moments, ensuring no one lingered too long on anything that might complicate the story she wanted told. My father worked the room with the practiced confidence of a man who believed his version of events was the only one that mattered. No one mentioned that I was his daughter. The exclusion wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was smooth, efficient, and deeply familiar. And for the first time, it didn't hurt the way it once had. Somewhere along the way, the sting had dulled into clarity. I took a slow breath and let my gaze drift back to the villa. From this angle, I noticed details others missed. The way staff moved with a kind of quiet tension. The way a conversation near the catering table abruptly lowered when someone mentioned timing. The way the front gate was checked and rechecked, as if someone important was expected. It struck me then that this night wasn't only about celebrating my father's retirement or showcasing my brother's success. There was something else running beneath the surface, something carefully scheduled, something no one was talking about openly. My father caught my eye from across the lawn. For a brief moment his expression hardened, as if reminding himself that I was still there, still out of place. Then he smiled again and turned back to his audience, confident that he had handled me. They all believed the same thing. They believed I had been put in my place. They believed this night belonged to them. Standing there, unnoticed and unchallenged, I understood something they didn't. This was the moment they felt most secure, and that made it the most dangerous moment of all. I didn't need to move. I didn't need to speak. I only needed to stay exactly where I was and let the evening unfold, because whatever they thought they were celebrating tonight, it wasn't going to be the story anyone remembered. Nothing about what had just happened seemed to trouble anyone but me. The party flowed on as if my father hadn't blocked me at the entrance, as if my mother hadn't whispered that I didn't belong, as if being publicly diminished were simply another acceptable form of entertainment. That realization settled over me more heavily than the humiliation itself. I stayed where I was, near the edge of the lawn, holding a glass I hadn't touched. People passed by, conversations overlapping in practiced warmth. No one checked on me. No one looked uncomfortable on my behalf. The ease with which they moved on told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't shocking to them. It was familiar. In my family, nothing happened by accident. We operated on an unspoken hierarchy that everyone understood without needing to name it. My father sat at the top, his approval treated like currency. My mother existed just beside him, not loud, not commanding, but relentless in her control of appearances. Together they decided what reality looked like, and everyone else adjusted accordingly. My brother was their safest investment, the success story they liked to tell and retell. Every achievement of his was magnified, polished, and displayed. When people spoke to him, they spoke with admiration already prepared, as if it would have been impolite to question the narrative. He absorbed praise easily, the way people do when they've never had to doubt their own place. And then there was me. I wasn't the family failure in any dramatic sense. No scandals, no visible collapse. I was something far more inconvenient. I was the child who didn't fit the story they wanted to sell. That made me a liability, and liabilities in my family were managed quietly. I watched my brother laugh with a group of guests near the villa's entrance. He gestured broadly, explaining something about the layout, the views, the potential. He spoke with confidence, but I noticed how carefully he avoided specifics. He knew enough to sound impressive. He always had. But there was a difference between repeating information and owning it. The difference had never mattered before. My mother drifted past him, adjusting a sleeve, refilling a glass, stepping in smoothly when conversations edged too close to something unscripted. She was remarkably good at it. I had spent years mistaking that skill for kindness. When she glanced in my direction, her eyes didn't soften. They sharpened just slightly, checking to see if I was still under control. When she saw that I was standing quietly, not drawing attention, she relaxed. That was all she needed from me. Compliance without protest. A man I didn't recognize stopped near me, looking from my face to the villa. "So," he said lightly, "are you visiting from out of town?" It was an innocent enough question, delivered with a smile, but it carried an assumption I had heard my entire life. That I was temporary. That I didn't belong here long-term. That my presence required explanation. "I'm just here for the evening," I replied. He nodded, satisfied, and moved on without another thought. The conclusion he drew was easier than the truth. That was how it worked. People filled in the gaps with whatever story required the least effort. My family counted on that. They counted on my silence to do most of the work for them. I thought back to all the gatherings before this one, the birthdays, the holidays, the dinners where my role had been the same. Say little, smile politely, leave before anything uncomfortable could happen. Every time I followed that script, it reinforced their version of who I was. Tonight, by staying, I was already deviating from it. The villa loomed behind my brother, its lights glowing steadily. Guests admired it openly, speaking as if it were proof of careful planning and impeccable judgment. I listened closely, letting their words wash over me, and noticed what they weren't saying. No one mentioned financing. No one mentioned process. They spoke of outcome as if outcome existed in a vacuum. A server paused near the catering table, murmuring something to another staff member. I caught fragments: timing, paperwork, waiting. The words slid past most people unnoticed, but they lodged in my mind. There was an undercurrent to this evening that had nothing to do with celebration. My mother appeared at my side without warning. "You look tired," she said softly, her voice pitched just right to sound caring. "You don't have to stay the whole night." I met her gaze. For a moment something flickered there, irritation perhaps, or concern that wasn't entirely about my well-being. She was measuring me, deciding whether I posed a risk. "I'm fine," I said. She hesitated, clearly unused to that answer, then nodded and moved away. To anyone watching, it would have looked like a gentle exchange between mother and daughter. To me, it felt like a test. As the night wore on, the confidence around me grew louder. My father laughed more freely. My brother relaxed further into the attention. They believed the difficult part was over. They believed I had been handled. Standing there, unseen, I understood the truth of my position with painful clarity. I wasn't excluded because I failed to earn my place. I was excluded because my presence disrupted the balance they relied on. Their story required contrast, and I had been cast in that role long ago. I didn't feel angry. I felt resolved. I looked again toward the villa, noticing the way staff moved with quiet urgency, the way the front gate was watched, the way certain conversations stopped when others approached. Something was coming, something that had nothing to do with me trying to prove my worth. For once, I didn't feel the need to correct anyone. I didn't need to defend myself. The longer they held on to their assumptions, the more exposed they would be when those assumptions collapsed. I stayed exactly where I was, letting the night continue to believe it belonged to them, knowing it wouldn't for much longer. They hadn't bothered to ask what I did anymore. That was the part that struck me as I stood there watching the party from a distance, the realization settling in with unexpected calm. At some point, curiosity about me had been replaced by certainty. They thought they already knew who I was, and that made my silence feel almost luxurious. I used to mistake that certainty for judgment. Now I understood it as something else entirely. It was convenience. Asking questions risked answers they didn't want to hear. From the outside, my life looked simple, even small, if you believed the version my family quietly circulated. I dressed without logos. I drove a car that blended in. I lived in a place that didn't announce itself. None of that was accidental. It was the result of years spent learning what happened when I allowed the wrong people access to my progress. In the early days, I had been open. I shared details the way people do when they still believe effort will be recognized fairly. I talked about projects, about opportunities, about plans. Each time, the response followed a familiar pattern: a polite nod, a dismissive smile, a comment about being careful not to get ahead of myself. Then there was the night that changed everything. It had been years ago, at a smaller family gathering, nothing nearly as elaborate as this gala. I had just completed a deal that meant something to me, my first real proof that I wasn't imagining my own competence. I mentioned it casually, not to boast, just to share something that mattered. The room had gone quiet for a beat too long. My father had broken the silence with a thin smile. "Let's see if it lasts," he said. My mother followed quickly, reminding me not to count things that weren't guaranteed. My brother said nothing at all, already being congratulated for something he hadn't yet done. Later that evening, I overheard my achievement being reframed as luck, then as overconfidence, then as a distraction from what really mattered. By the end of the night, it barely sounded like mine anymore. I never brought it up again. From that point on, I learned to keep my work separate from my family. Not out of spite, but out of preservation. Every time I shared, it was reshaped into something smaller. Every time I stayed quiet, I retained ownership. Invisibility stopped being a punishment and became a choice. Back at the gala, the consequences of that choice surrounded me. People spoke freely around me, assuming there was nothing I could add. They filled the silence with their own conclusions, and I let them. My phone vibrated once in my hand, subtle but insistent. I angled it away from curious glances and looked down. A short message, precise and urgent, referencing documents and timing. It was the kind of message that didn't appear unless something needed attention now. I didn't respond. I lifted my eyes to the villa instead, watching the way light spilled from its windows, the way guests admired it without understanding the layers beneath the surface. The coincidence was too neat to ignore. This night mattered in more ways than one, and I had known, somewhere deep down, that it would. Another vibration followed, then another. Each one carried weight, not emotional, but practical. Decisions, consequences, the quiet pressure of responsibility. I felt the familiar pull to step away, to handle what needed handling, to prioritize the part of my life that functioned without drama or performance. If I left now, my absence would be noted, interpreted, used. It would become proof of whatever story they preferred to tell about me. I could already hear it. She never stays. She doesn't understand family occasions. She always has something else to do. I slipped the phone back into my clutch without answering. The choice cost me something. I knew that. Silence always did. People assumed it was free, that withholding explanation required no effort. They never saw what it demanded in return. Across the lawn, my father was holding court again, telling a story known well enough that he no longer needed to embellish it. My mother laughed at exactly the right moments. My brother leaned against the stone railing, perfectly at ease. None of them noticed the moment I weighed my priorities and chose to stay. A woman drifted past me, lowering her voice as she spoke to someone beside her. "I heard there's paperwork involved," she said, as if sharing a minor inconvenience. The other woman frowned, then shrugged. They moved on. Paperwork, timing, waiting. The words repeated themselves in my mind, aligning with the messages I hadn't answered. I studied the villa again, this time with sharper focus. Certain details stood out now. The way questions were redirected, the way staff moved carefully around certain areas, the way no one quite said who was responsible for what. I realized then that the house wasn't just a backdrop. It was part of the story I had been trying not to think about, the one I assumed had been buried and forgotten, the one they believed would never matter again. Another message arrived, more direct this time, pressing for confirmation. I typed a brief response, careful and controlled, authorizing a contingency I hoped I wouldn't need. It wasn't ideal, it was acceptable. Sometimes that was enough. As I slipped the phone away, my father's laughter carried across the lawn, louder than before. He caught my eye for a fraction of a second, his expression satisfied, as if reassured by my continued silence. He believed he had contained the situation. That belief settled him. I felt no urge to correct him. The longer they underestimated me, the more thoroughly they exposed themselves. I had learned that lesson the hard way, and I wasn't interested in repeating it. I stayed where I was, outwardly still, inwardly calculating, watching a night built on assumptions inch closer to a moment none of them had prepared for. The villa looked different once I stopped seeing it the way everyone else did. From a distance it was still impressive, all stone and glass and warm light spilling onto the lawn. But when I focused, really focused, the illusion began to thin. Appearances were doing most of the work for them tonight. Guests spoke about the house with the lazy confidence of people repeating what they had been told. Prime location, excellent timing, a smart investment. The phrases circulated like approved talking points, passed from one conversation to the next without scrutiny. I listened closely, not to what they said, but to what they avoided. No one mentioned financing. No one talked about banks or lenders or interest rates. No one referenced the usual details people love to dissect when something truly belonged to them. They spoke only of outcomes, never process, as if the villa had materialized fully formed, a reward rather than a transaction. I let my gaze drift across the structure, noting angles and choices others overlooked. Certain features were designed to impress at first glance, but not all of them made sense together. The timeline my brother casually recited didn't quite align with what I knew of the market at the time. It wasn't obvious, it didn't scream mistake, but it nagged at me in the way small inconsistencies always did. A cluster of guests nearby debated property values, gesturing toward the house. Someone asked how quickly it had closed. My brother answered smoothly, almost too smoothly, repeating a phrase I suspected he'd been coached to use. Before anyone could ask a follow-up, my father stepped in, redirecting the conversation toward views and lifestyle. The moment passed, but the deflection stayed with me. I moved closer to the edge of the patio, close enough to hear the staff speaking quietly among themselves. Their movements were careful, measured, not quite matching the relaxed tone of the party. One of them glanced toward the front gate, then back toward the house, her mouth tightening slightly. "Still waiting," she murmured to someone beside her. "For tonight?" the other asked. She nodded. "Everything depends on it." They separated quickly when a guest approached, their conversation dissolving into professional smiles. I stood still, letting the words settle, waiting. Tonight. Everything depends on it. Those weren't the kinds of phrases that belonged to a retirement celebration. I felt it then, the certainty forming quietly beneath my ribs. The villa wasn't just being admired, it was being monitored. My mother appeared at my side before I noticed her approach. "You're hovering," she said lightly, as if teasing. "Try to look like you're enjoying yourself." "I am," I replied. She studied my face, searching for something, then glanced in the direction of the house. Her smile faltered for half a second before she corrected it. "It's a big night for your brother," she said. "Let's not complicate things." There it was, not a request, a warning. I watched her walk away, heels clicking softly against the stone, already adjusting her posture for the next group of guests. She wasn't concerned about my feelings. She was concerned about containment, about making sure nothing unexpected surfaced. Across the lawn, my brother was laughing again, his shoulders loose, his confidence intact. He looked like a man enjoying his own success, but I noticed the way his eyes flicked toward my father whenever questions veered too close to details. He lived in the villa, but he didn't seem to command it. There was a subtle difference, one most people would never notice, but once seen, it couldn't be unseen. He knew how to present the house. He didn't know how to defend it. Another guest approached him, asking about renovations, about changes he planned to make. My brother spoke enthusiastically, outlining ideas, possibilities, visions for the future. He sounded convincing. Yet beneath the words was a careful avoidance of anything that suggested final authority. He spoke as if permission were assumed, not guaranteed. I stepped back, absorbing the scene. The villa had been elevated all evening, treated as proof of something solid and earned. And yet, the more attention it received, the more fragile it seemed. It was a symbol balanced on a narrow point, dependent on agreements no one here was willing to discuss. A server passed by again, her expression tight. "They're asking about the documents," she said quietly to a colleague. "I don't know what to tell them." Her colleague shook his head. "Just stall." The word lodged in my mind. Stall. That was not the language of celebration. That was the language of delay, of uncertainty, of someone waiting for an outcome they couldn't control. I felt a flicker of something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not even anticipation. Recognition. The house, the night, the tension humming beneath the surface. It all traced back to a decision made long before this party existed. A decision my family believed was finished, resolved, safely buried. They were wrong. My father raised his glass again, drawing attention with practiced ease. He spoke about legacy, about milestones, about how proud he was of what his family had accomplished. The guests applauded, some genuinely, some reflexively. My brother smiled, basking in the approval. My mother nodded, satisfied. I watched the villa glow behind them, beautiful and precarious, and understood with unsettling clarity that its stability depended on something they had dismissed years ago. Something they had underestimated, something they no longer remembered to fear. I didn't move. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask questions they weren't prepared to answer. I simply stood there, letting the night continue its performance, knowing that beneath the polished surface, the foundation was already being tested. I hadn't thought about that meeting in years, not consciously at least. But standing there with the villa glowing behind my family like a shrine, the memory surfaced with uncomfortable clarity. They had certainly never imagined it would matter again. Back then, it hadn't been a gala or a celebration. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind my parents preferred when they needed something handled without witnesses. We sat around a polished table, papers spread neatly in front of us, the atmosphere tense but controlled. There had been a problem, one of those problems families like mine never acknowledged publicly. A financial exposure, a legal complication, something that needed restructuring quickly and discreetly. My father spoke with authority, laying out the urgency. My mother focused on outcomes, not process. My brother sat back, unusually silent, his confidence dulled by the realization that something had gone wrong beyond his control. And then there was me, invited not as a daughter, but as a tool. They wanted a solution that would protect appearances above all else, a structure that would shift responsibility without drawing attention, a way to keep assets intact while insulating the people who mattered most. It was all perfectly legal, just aggressive enough to feel clever rather than reckless. I remember listening carefully, my mind already tracing consequences they didn't want to hear about. When I pointed out the long-term risks, my father cut me off with a dismissive wave. "We're not here to debate," he said. "We're here to fix this." My mother nodded, reinforcing the message with practiced calm. "This doesn't need to be complicated," she added. "We just need it done." My brother avoided my eyes. The solution they favored relied on a layered ownership structure, one that separated use from control in a way that felt convenient in the short term. I warned them what it could mean down the line, how authority could shift depending on circumstances, how assumptions could fail when tested. They didn't want warnings. They wanted reassurance. In that moment, I understood my position perfectly. I could refuse and be sidelined entirely, dismissed as difficult and uncooperative. Or I could comply, help them secure what they wanted, and watch my contribution disappear the moment the crisis passed. I chose a third option. I agreed to handle the technical aspects, to make the structure work as intended, but I insisted on one small provision. A clause that preserved a specific decision point, something narrow enough to seem insignificant, something they were eager to overlook. My father barely glanced at it. My mother was already thinking ahead. My brother didn't ask a single question. They signed. The problem was resolved quickly after that. The risk was contained. The family moved on as if nothing had happened. Credit flowed upward, as it always did. My father spoke about his leadership. My brother returned to his comfortable orbit. My role in the resolution was never mentioned again. That was when I learned the difference between being useful and being valued. I stopped expecting acknowledgement after that. I stopped explaining myself. I took what I needed from the experience and quietly withdrew from the parts of my family life that demanded erasure as the price of inclusion. Standing in the present, with the party humming around me, the connection was impossible to ignore. The villa existed because of that decision. Its stability depended on the same structure they had once dismissed as a mere formality. The foundation they were celebrating so openly rested on a detail they had forgotten, and I had not. Time hadn't erased that choice. It had simply waited. I looked at the house again, seeing it now through the lens of that memory. the careful avoidance of specifics, the staff's tension, the references to documents and timing. It all aligned with quiet precision. This wasn't coincidence. It was consequence. A voice cut through my thoughts as a guest laughed nearby, oblivious. The contrast was almost surreal. Music drifted across the lawn. Glasses clinked. My father's voice rose again, confident and proud, weaving another story about success and legacy. My mother smiled beside him, satisfied that the evening was unfolding exactly as planned. They believed the past was settled, that whatever compromises they had made were safely buried, their relevance expired. I knew better. When someone mentioned the realtor again, casually this time, the word landed differently. Not as a curiosity, but as confirmation. I understood why timing mattered, why stalling mattered, why the energy of the night felt strained beneath its polished surface. They weren't waiting for a guest. They were waiting for accountability. I didn't feel vindictive. I didn't feel eager. I felt steady, prepared. The kind of calm that comes from recognizing a pattern reaching its natural conclusion. I glanced once more at my family, standing together beneath the lights, so certain of their positions, so unaware of how fragile certainty could be. They had underestimated the past. They had underestimated me. And now, without realizing it, they were about to face the one thing they could never manage. The truth doesn't rush. It doesn't announce itself. It waits patiently for the moment it's needed most. And tonight, it was already on its way. The music was still playing, the lights still warm, the smiles still practiced. But something fundamental had shifted. I felt it as soon as I pulled myself fully back into the present, as if the air itself had tightened. Nothing had visibly changed, and yet everything had. My father was at his most confident then. He moved through the guests with the relaxed authority of a man who believed the difficult parts of the evening were behind him. His voice carried easily as he spoke about retirement, about freedom, about finally enjoying the rewards of a lifetime of discipline. People nodded, laughed, raised their glasses. He had always been good at commanding a room, especially when no one thought to challenge him. My mother stayed close, adjusting details no one else noticed. A chair shifted slightly, a conversation redirected. A laugh smoothed over a pause that lingered too long. She was already operating in maintenance mode, preserving the illusion that the night was unfolding exactly as intended. Her eyes flicked toward me periodically, quick and sharp, making sure I remained quiet and contained. My brother looked almost serene. The earlier tension I had noticed in him had eased, replaced by the comfort of familiarity. He leaned against the stone railing near the villa, drink in hand, accepting admiration without effort. People asked about his plans, his vision, his future. He spoke easily, as if those things were fixed and guaranteed. He believed the house behind him was solid ground. I stayed at the edge of it all, watching the performance continue. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were celebrating control at the exact moment it was slipping from their grasp. A pair of guests drifted past me, their voices low but unconcerned. "He must be relieved," one said. "Retirement suits him." The other agreed, adding something about legacy and timing. They moved on, satisfied, unaware that timing was the one thing no one here truly controlled. My phone vibrated again in my hand. I didn't need to look to know what it was. I could feel the urgency through the screen, the quiet insistence of matters that didn't pause for social performances. I glanced down anyway, just long enough to confirm what I already knew. A question. A request for confirmation. A reminder that waiting indefinitely wasn't an option. I slipped the phone away without answering. The decision settled heavily in my chest. Staying came with a cost, and I was paying it in real time. If nothing happened tonight, if this entire sense of anticipation dissolved into nothing more than another uncomfortable family memory, the loss would be mine alone. They would never know what I had delayed, what I had risked to remain here. My mother appeared beside me, her approach so quiet I barely registered it until she spoke. "You've done enough," she said gently, her tone suggesting concern rather than command. "You don't have to stay." I met her eyes. Up close, I could see the strain beneath her composure, the calculation behind her kindness. She wasn't offering me an out. She was trying to remove a variable. "I'm fine," I replied. Her smile faltered just slightly. "It's been a long day." "For you," I said evenly. She studied my face, clearly unsettled by my refusal to follow the script. After a moment, she nodded and stepped away, already recalibrating. To anyone watching, it would have looked like a caring exchange. To me, it felt like the last warning before something broke. Across the lawn, my father lifted his glass again, calling for attention. He launched into another story, this one about resilience, about weathering challenges and coming out stronger. The irony pressed against me, sharp and insistent. He spoke of adaptability as if it were a personal virtue, not something he had spent decades denying others. The guests responded as expected, clapping and murmuring approval. My brother smiled beside him, his posture loose, his confidence intact. They were at the peak of their certainty now, convinced the narrative was secure. That was when I noticed the staff. It wasn't anything dramatic. No sudden rush, no announcement, just a subtle change in their movements. One of them checked the front gate again, more deliberately this time. Another leaned in to whisper to a supervisor, her expression tense. A glance was exchanged. Then another. The rhythm of the evening faltered, just enough for someone paying attention to feel it. I didn't move. I didn't look toward the gate. I knew better than to telegraph anticipation. Instead, I focused on the sounds around me, the way conversations dipped and rose, the way laughter came a fraction of a second too late. People sensed something was off even if they couldn't articulate it. My phone vibrated once more. This time, I silenced it completely. Whatever happened next would happen without my intervention. That was the point. I wasn't here to force a moment. I was here to witness it. My father's gaze swept the lawn, lingering briefly on the villa before returning to his audience. For the first time that night, his eyes flicked toward the gate just for an instant, as if responding to an impulse he didn't fully understand. He frowned slightly, then smiled again, dismissing the feeling. My mother followed his glance, her expression tightening before she smoothed it away. She said something to my brother, who straightened, his attention sharpening. None of them spoke openly about what they felt. They didn't know how. I felt it clearly. This was the pause before impact, the moment when control is assumed and therefore most vulnerable. They believed the night was under control because nothing had challenged them yet. They didn't realize that the challenge had already arrived, quietly, without ceremony. I stood there, calm and still, no longer weighing options or calculating risks. The decisions had been made. The structures were in place. All that remained was for the truth to enter the room. They were still celebrating when it happened, still convinced they were at the center of everything. And for the first time that night, I knew with absolute certainty that they were about to find out how wrong they had been. The car arrived without ceremony. No music paused, no heads turned immediately, no one announced anything at all. It rolled up to the front gate, with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need permission to enter. I noticed before anyone else did. The driver stepped out first, opened the rear door, and a woman emerged into the soft wash of landscape lighting. She wasn't dressed for a gala. No sequins, no statement jewelry, no attempt to match the tone of celebration. Her suit was tailored, dark, precise, the kind of clothing that didn't ask for attention because it assumed it. She paused just long enough to take in the scene. The villa, the guests, the way the evening had arranged itself around certain people. Her eyes moved quickly, efficiently, cataloging details. This wasn't curiosity. It was assessment. The room hadn't noticed her yet, but it was about to. A staff member saw her first. I watched the change ripple through his posture, the way his shoulders straightened, the way his expression shifted from service to deference. He approached her immediately, speaking in a low voice. She nodded once, brief and decisive, and followed him through the gate. That was when conversations began to falter. People didn't know why they were distracted, only that something had pulled their attention. A laugh trailed off mid-sentence. Someone glanced over a shoulder, then again. The music kept playing, but the rhythm of the night lost its smoothness. My father sensed it seconds later. He always did. His instincts for shifts in power were sharp, even if he didn't always understand their source. I saw his gaze track across the lawn until it landed on the unfamiliar figure moving calmly through his carefully curated event. He adjusted his jacket and smiled, already stepping into host mode. My mother noticed him moving and followed his line of sight. Her expression tightened, just briefly, before she masked it. She leaned toward my brother, said something quickly. He straightened, setting his glass aside, interest sharpening into opportunity. They assumed she was another audience member, another person to impress. My father reached her first. "Welcome," he said warmly, extending his hand with the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to being important. "I'm the host. We're celebrating my retirement." She accepted his handshake politely, her grip firm but brief. "Congratulations," she replied. Her tone was professional, not admiring. Her eyes moved past him almost immediately, back to the villa. "It's my son's place," my father continued, eager to establish context. "Quite an achievement." "Yes," she said neutrally. "I've seen it." That was all. No compliment, no curiosity, no follow-up. I watched confusion flicker across my father's face before he smoothed it away. He tried again, talking about location, about timing, about how competitive the market had been. She listened, nodded once, then thanked him and stepped aside, disengaging with the ease of someone who decided conversations, not endured them. My brother moved in next, smiling broadly, launching into a more detailed explanation of the villa's features, his plans, his vision. He spoke with enthusiasm, gesturing toward the house as if inviting her admiration. She let him speak for a moment. Then she smiled politely and excused herself, turning toward a small cluster of guests I recognized as actual investors. People who didn't talk loudly. People who didn't need to. The effect was immediate. Eyes followed her. Conversations shifted. People recalibrated their positions, drifting subtly in her direction without quite realizing why. The villa, moments ago the unquestioned centerpiece of the evening, began to fade into the background. She spoke quietly, efficiently, asking questions, listening more than she talked. Those she engaged with responded differently than they had with my family. Straighter posture, focused attention, a hint of respect that hadn't been present before. Then her eyes found me. It wasn't dramatic. No pause, no smile meant for an audience, just a brief, precise moment of recognition. A small nod, professional and contained. I didn't react. I didn't smile back or step forward. I held her gaze for exactly as long as was appropriate, then looked away. The exchange was so subtle most people missed it. Most people. My father didn't. I saw him watching us now, his expression shifting from confusion to something closer to unease. He looked from her to me and back again, trying to assemble a connection that didn't fit his understanding of the evening. My mother followed his gaze, her face tightening as she registered the same exchange. She leaned toward him, whispering urgently. He shook his head, dismissive, but the confidence had drained from his posture. The woman continued moving through the party, never staying long in one place. She wasn't networking, she was evaluating. People adjusted themselves around her, sensing that whatever she represented mattered more than whatever they had been praising all night. A man near me murmured, "Who is she?" to no one in particular. No one answered. That was when I understood something important. The room had stopped listening to my family, not abruptly, not rebelliously, simply by redirecting its attention to someone whose authority didn't require explanation. My brother tried once more to reassert himself, positioning himself near her as she spoke with another guest. He waited for a pause that never came. Eventually, he stepped back, his confidence visibly dimmed. My father stood near the center of the lawn now, scanning faces, searching for the familiar feedback loop of admiration. It didn't come. Conversations continued without him. Laughter erupted elsewhere. For the first time that night, he was no longer the axis. I remained where I was, outwardly unchanged, inwardly steady. I didn't need to move closer. I didn't need to claim space. The space was already shifting. As the woman passed by again, closer this time, she slowed just enough to speak. "Good evening," she said quietly. "Good evening," I replied. Nothing more was exchanged, but several people saw it, and that was enough. By the time she moved on, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The villa was still beautiful. The party still ongoing, but the hierarchy had fractured, and everyone felt it, even if they couldn't name it. My family stood together now, no longer commanding the room but reacting to it. Their certainty had cracked, replaced by a shared, unspoken question. Who was she here for? And why had she acknowledged me first? They didn't know it yet, but the night no longer belonged to them. They were being watched, measured, and quietly reassessed, and there was no way back from that. Nothing had officially changed, and yet the entire atmosphere felt misaligned, like a song half a beat off. The music continued, glasses still clinked, and people smiled on cue, but the ease had drained out of the night. Conversations no longer flowed. They stalled, restarted, then stalled again. I watched it happen in real time. The woman moved through the gathering without hurry, stopping briefly here and there, never staying long enough to be claimed by any one group. Wherever she paused, attention followed. It wasn't curiosity exactly. It was recognition, instinctive and unspoken. People sensed authority the way animals sense weather. Someone gestured toward the villa and called it impressive, the word delivered with practiced enthusiasm. The woman tilted her head slightly, considering. "It's a pleasant property," she said. Her voice was calm, professional, typical for the area given the price point. The sentence landed softly, but its impact rippled outward. Pleasant. Typical. She hadn't criticized the villa. She hadn't dismissed it. She had done something far more damaging. She had placed it in a category that stripped it of its power. The house was no longer exceptional. It was merely adequate. I saw my father react a fraction of a second too late. He stepped forward, smiling broadly, eager to reclaim momentum. He spoke about the location, about appreciation, about timing. He talked faster than he had earlier, his confidence edging into insistence. She listened politely, nodded once, then turned away mid-thought to greet someone else. No argument, no disagreement, just disengagement. Being ignored was new to him. And it showed. My brother fared no better. He followed her line of movement, inserting himself with practiced charm, launching into plans for renovations, expansions, future upgrades. He spoke of potential, of vision, of what the villa would become. She listened for a moment, asked a brief, precise question, then smiled and excused herself again. It wasn't rude, it was efficient. The kind of efficiency that left no room for performance. My brother stood where she had left him, drink untouched, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief. He wasn't used to being dismissed. Not like that. Around us, the crowd began to shift in subtle ways. People who had been clustered around my father drifted toward other conversations. Guests who had spent the early evening admiring the villa now stood closer to the woman, listening intently as she spoke to others. The gravitational center of the night had moved. No one announced it. No one needed to. I noticed my mother watching closely, her composure tightening with each passing minute. She smiled when required, laughed when appropriate, but her eyes kept returning to the same point, tracking the woman's movements with growing unease. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't manageable. When the woman passed near me again, she slowed just enough to acknowledge my presence. "Good evening," she said quietly, as if we were old acquaintances passing in a hallway. "Good evening," I replied. That was all. But this time, people noticed. I felt it in the slight pause that followed, in the way a nearby conversation dropped a notch in volume. A few glances shifted from her to me and back again. Questions formed without words. Why me? My father noticed it too. He watched the exchange with forced indifference, then looked away too quickly. My mother leaned toward him, whispering urgently. He shook his head, dismissive, but the tension had already taken root. The villa, still glowing behind us, began to feel strangely irrelevant. It hadn't changed. The stone was the same, the lights were the same, but the meaning attached to it was slipping, unraveling thread by thread. I looked at it now and saw not achievement, but exposure. A woman near me murmured something about categories, about market segments. Another nodded thoughtfully. The language had shifted from admiration to analysis. Once that happened, there was no going back. Admiration could be reclaimed. Analysis could not. My father attempted to draw attention back to himself, telling a story meant to elicit laughter. The response was delayed, uneven. A few polite chuckles, then silence. People were distracted, their attention pulled elsewhere. For the first time that night, he looked uncertain. The woman spoke again, this time to a small group of guests who knew exactly what questions to ask. I caught fragments, off-market, discretion, all cash, entirely different scale. She spoke without emphasis, as if discussing weather patterns rather than fortunes. The effect was immediate. Heads turned, the villa was glanced at, then dismissed. Whatever pride had been built around it began to feel inflated, fragile. My mother's smile finally faltered. She scanned the crowd, recalculating, searching for a way to redirect the evening back to familiar ground. There was none. The narrative had slipped beyond her reach. I remained still, refusing the urge to step in, to clarify, to control. This wasn't my moment to speak. It was my moment to let the imbalance widen. When I met my brother's eyes briefly, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Fear, not of me, but of uncertainty. The house he had been standing on all night no longer felt solid beneath his feet. The woman moved on again, leaving behind a trail of recalibrated conversations and unsettled assumptions. The party continued, technically intact, but its heart had shifted elsewhere. I looked once more at the villa, then back at the guests, and understood the significance of what had just happened. The house hadn't been attacked. It hadn't been exposed. It had simply been reclassified, and once something is seen clearly for what it is, no amount of lighting can make it look extraordinary again. The night was still unfolding, but the first crack had appeared. It ran quietly through every conversation, every glance, every recalculated judgment. The facade was intact. The belief was not. People were still talking, but not the way they had been earlier. The easy flow of small talk had thinned into something more deliberate, more cautious. Voices lowered when the woman spoke. Laughter sounded measured, as if no one wanted to miss the next important sentence. I could feel the shift without turning my head. Attention had a weight to it, and it was no longer centered on my family. A man I recognized as a local developer leaned toward the woman, his posture noticeably respectful. He asked about the market, about whether certain opportunities were still moving quietly despite rising interest rates. She answered without hesitation, her tone even, precise, informed. She spoke about off-market activity as if it were routine, not exceptional. "It's where most of the serious movement is," she said. "Public listings rarely reflect the top end anymore." Someone asked what she meant by top end, clearly expecting a vague answer. She didn't give one. "There was a private closing recently," she said. "All cash, very discreet, around 20 million. The number slipped into the night without drama, but it changed the air instantly. A few people went still. Someone let out a low whistle before catching themselves. Eyes flicked instinctively toward the villa, then away again, as if the comparison embarrassed them. "Must be quite a client," a woman said lightly, trying to recover the conversational tone. The woman smiled, polite but reserved. "She values privacy," she replied. "Attention isn't part of her strategy." She. The single pronoun landed harder than the number. I felt the ripple as it moved through the crowd, the subtle recalibration of assumptions. A woman. Quiet. All cash. No public presence. It didn't fit the pattern people were used to celebrating. My father stepped in quickly, his voice a shade too loud. "There are many ways to define success," he said, gesturing broadly toward the villa. "This property represents a smart long-term investment." The woman listened, her expression neutral. "Different categories," she said calmly. "They serve different purposes." Different categories. The phrase settled like a verdict. The villa had just been moved out of the conversation without being insulted, dismissed without being attacked. It no longer competed. It simply existed somewhere else. I watched my mother's face drain of color. She recovered quickly, smiling, nodding, but her eyes darted between the woman and the guests now leaning in closer, suddenly more interested in a transaction that had nothing to do with my brother. My brother stood rigid near the edge of the group, his earlier ease gone. He opened his mouth once, then closed it again, as if realizing he had nothing relevant to add. Someone asked, almost casually, "Is your client in town?" The woman tilted her head slightly. She prefers to observe before she speaks. A few people laughed, uncertain whether it was a joke. I felt it then, the unmistakable pressure of attention sliding in my direction. Not boldly, not yet. Just a shift in where people looked when the woman finished a sentence, a pause that lingered a beat longer than before. I didn't move. I didn't smile or step away. I held my posture steady, refusing to either invite or deflect the scrutiny. Any reaction would have been interpreted as confirmation or denial. Either would weaken the moment. Silence was cleaner. My father noticed the glances. His jaw tightened as he followed the line of sight from the woman to me and back again. He laughed abruptly, a sound meant to disrupt the pattern. "Well," he said, "I suppose mystery makes everything more interesting." No one responded. The woman continued speaking, unfazed. She mentioned discretion again, control, decision-making authority. She spoke about how her clients preferred environments where information traveled slowly and accurately, environments where assumptions were costly. I could feel the room absorbing that sentence, measuring it against the night unfolding around us. A man near the bar leaned toward another guest. "Imagine having that kind of leverage," he murmured. "Imagine not needing anyone to know," the other replied. The comparison was complete now. The villa, once the crown jewel of the evening, felt suddenly loud, almost desperate in its visibility. Whatever power it had symbolized earlier had evaporated under the weight of a different standard. My mother moved closer to my father, whispering urgently. He shook his head, his expression caught between disbelief and irritation. They were trying to regain control of a narrative that no longer belonged to them. The woman paused, sensing the tension, and allowed the silence to stretch. It was deliberate, effective. People leaned in without realizing they were doing it. Someone finally asked the question everyone had been circling. "Is your VIP client here tonight?" The woman didn't answer immediately. I felt my father's gaze lock onto me, sharp and searching. For the first time that evening, he wasn't looking past me. He was looking at me. The woman smiled, just slightly. "I don't discuss my clients publicly," she said. "But I will say this. She understands the value of waiting." The words echoed in the space between us. Waiting. I remained still, my expression unchanged, my hands relaxed at my sides. I could sense the room recalibrating, the mental math happening behind polite faces. People weren't asking who I was anymore. They were reconsidering why they had been so sure they knew. The question hung there, unanswered but transformed. It was no longer about wealth, it was about judgment, about who had been wrong and how publicly. The night hadn't reached its breaking point yet, but the direction was set. Whatever came next would not require me to speak at all. The question didn't disappear after it was asked. It hovered in the air, heavy and unresolved, forcing everyone to confront the silence that followed. No one rushed to fill it. Even the music seemed quieter, as if the night itself had paused to listen. The woman let the moment stretch. She didn't look at me right away. She didn't look at my father either. Instead, she addressed the small circle of guests who had been leaning closer with every word she spoke. "I work exclusively with clients who value discretion," she said calmly. "People who don't confuse visibility with control." Her tone wasn't defensive. It didn't need to be. She was stating a fact, not responding to a challenge. One of the guests, a man who had been listening intently, frowned slightly. "You mentioned assets discussed tonight," he said carefully. "Are you referring to this property?" The woman nodded once. "Among others." The shift was immediate. Heads turned, then stilled. The villa, glowing just beyond the group, suddenly felt exposed, as if the lights illuminating it were too bright. My father laughed, sharp and forced. "I'm not sure what you're implying," he said, stepping forward. "My son owns this home." The woman met his gaze without flinching. "Ownership is rarely as simple as people like to believe," she replied. "Use, occupancy, and authority don't always align." A murmur rippled through the guests. This was no longer a vague conversation about markets or trends. This was specific. She continued, her voice steady. "In certain structures, decision-making power rests with someone who isn't living in the property, someone whose consent matters more than appearances." The man who had asked the question earlier looked between her and the villa, then back again. "Are you saying this house isn't fully controlled by the person presenting it tonight?" "I'm saying," she answered carefully, "that there are circumstances under which its future can be determined by someone else." The silence that followed was absolute. I saw my brother's face drain of color. He took a half step back, then stopped himself, glancing instinctively toward my father as if waiting for reassurance that didn't come. My mother's hands tightened around her clutch, her smile frozen in place, eyes darting rapidly as she tried to calculate damage control. My father attempted another laugh, but it fell flat. "That's a dramatic way to describe standard arrangements," he said. "Anyone can claim leverage." The woman didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice or produce documents. She simply said, "Records don't argue." The words landed with quiet finality. People shifted uncomfortably, their earlier curiosity hardening into something more serious. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was information, the kind that reorders how rooms function. I felt eyes on me again, stronger this time. Not suspicion, recognition, the kind that forms when pieces fall into place too neatly to ignore. The woman turned then, finally, and faced me. "I'll wait for your instruction," she said. It wasn't loud, it wasn't ceremonial, but it was unmistakable. A few guests inhaled sharply. Someone whispered something under their breath. My father stared at me, disbelief breaking through his carefully managed expression. He looked as if he wanted to speak, to deny, to reassert control the way he always had, but nothing came out. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I met the woman's gaze and gave a small nod. Nothing more. The acknowledgement was subtle, deliberate, and irrevocable. The effect was immediate. Conversation ceased entirely. The space around us felt newly defined, as if an invisible line had been drawn and everyone instinctively knew where to stand. My brother finally found his voice. "This is ridiculous," he said, though it sounded more like a question than a declaration. "That's not how this works." The woman didn't look at him. "It's exactly how it works," she replied. "It's just not how it's usually explained." My mother stepped forward, her tone soft, conciliatory. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said. "This is a family matter." The woman's expression didn't change. "That's precisely why discretion was built into it," she said. "Family matters are rarely simple." I watched as the understanding settled over the guests one by one. No one needed a full explanation. They had enough. More than enough. The story my family had spent years curating had encountered a version of reality that didn't bend to charm or repetition. The villa no longer looked like a trophy, it looked like a question mark. My father straightened, gathering himself for one last attempt. "You're my daughter," he said, his voice tight. "I would know if you had this kind of authority." Several people looked at him, then at me, then back again. "Would you?" someone asked quietly. The question cut deeper than any accusation. I stayed where I was, calm and composed, letting the moment exist without interference. This wasn't about correcting them. It was about removing their ability to define me at all. The woman stepped back slightly, returning to her professional distance. "We can discuss next steps privately," she said to me. "When you're ready." I nodded again. No applause followed, no dramatic outburst. The night didn't explode the way people expected moments like this to. It collapsed, quietly, completely. And as the truth settled into the space my family had controlled for so long, I understood something with perfect clarity. They hadn't lost money. They hadn't lost status. They had lost something far more valuable. They had lost the power to speak for me. And there was nothing they could do to get it back. The party didn't end after that. It simply continued without its center. Music still played, glasses were still refilled, and people still smiled when they crossed paths. But the ease was gone. Conversations fractured into smaller, quieter clusters, and every movement felt measured, as if no one wanted to be caught standing on the wrong side of whatever had just shifted. I noticed it immediately. The way guests no longer gravitated toward my father. The way they angled their bodies away from him. Polite but distant, as if instinctively creating space. The authority he had carried so effortlessly earlier in the night no longer traveled with him. It had been exposed, and once seen clearly, it couldn't be unseen. He tried anyway. I watched him approach a group of longtime family friends, his posture straightening, his voice warming into the familiar cadence of reassurance. He laughed, gestured, spoke about misunderstandings and timing, about how these things always sounded more dramatic than they really were. They listened. They nodded. But their eyes drifted elsewhere, sliding back toward me and the woman who stood nearby, speaking quietly to someone else. For the first time I could remember, my father wasn't being believed by default. My mother chose a different approach. She waited until I was momentarily alone, then appeared at my side with a softness that would have fooled anyone who didn't know her as well as I did. Her voice was low, intimate, carefully calibrated. "Sweetheart," she said, touching my arm lightly. "We should talk privately. This has gone far enough." I looked down at her hand, then back at her face. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't even asking. She was trying to regain access, to pull me back into a familiar dynamic where conversations happened behind closed doors and outcomes were decided without witnesses. "Not tonight," I said. It was a simple boundary. 2 words. Nothing emotional, nothing dramatic. Her hand fell away as if she'd been burned. For a moment she seemed genuinely lost, her usual scripts failing her. Then she nodded stiffly and stepped back, already recalibrating, already searching for another angle. Across the lawn, my brother hovered near the villa, no longer its proud guardian, but a man stranded beside a structure that had suddenly become a liability. He watched people pass without stopping, his earlier confidence replaced by something brittle and uncertain. When he finally approached me, his voice was low, urgent. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked. The question wasn't about honesty. It was about safety, about why the shield he'd always relied on had failed without warning. "There was nothing to tell," I replied. He opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. For perhaps the first time in his life, there was no one stepping in to smooth things over for him. No one translating consequences into something softer. He retreated without another word, his confusion trailing after him like a shadow. People began approaching me then, one by one. Some offered vague apologies. Others made careful comments about assumptions and first impressions. A few simply acknowledged me with a nod that hadn't been there before. The shift in how they spoke to me was subtle, but unmistakable. Their voices were lower, their questions more considered. The room had reorganized itself. My family stood together now, a tight cluster near the edge of the gathering, their isolation made more obvious by contrast. My father watched as conversations flowed around them, no longer passing through him. My mother stood rigid at his side, her smile brittle. The dynamic they had curated for decades was dissolving in real time. I could have explained everything then. I could have clarified roles, outlined decisions, filled in gaps, but I didn't. Explanation would have given them something to push against. Silence left them nothing. The woman approached me once more, her tone returning to professional neutrality. "We can speak later," she said, "when you're ready." I nodded. "Thank you." She moved away, leaving behind a wake of awareness that didn't need her presence to persist. My father finally approached me directly. He looked older up close, his certainty worn thin by the effort of maintaining it. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly. I met his gaze, steady and calm. "I didn't do anything," I replied. "I stayed." He searched my face, perhaps looking for the daughter he believed he understood, the one he could manage, correct, define. He didn't find her. Whatever response he'd prepared faltered, then vanished altogether. There was nothing left for either of us to say. As the night wound down, people began to leave in small groups, offering polite goodbyes that carried new weight. The villa stood behind us, still illuminated, still impressive to the eye, but emptied of its earlier significance. It had become just another house, stripped of the story it had been propped up to tell. I chose my moment carefully. When I turned toward the exit, no one blocked my path. No one told me to wait. No one suggested I should stay. I walked past my family without slowing, without offering explanation or reassurance. They didn't follow. Outside the gate, the night air felt different. Lighter, quieter. I took a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. I hadn't won by humiliating anyone. I hadn't raised my voice or made demands. I had simply allowed the truth to exist where it could no longer be ignored. Behind me, the party continued in fragments, its old rhythm permanently broken. Ahead of me, there was nothing to manage, nothing to perform, nothing to prove. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't leaving because I had been pushed out. I was leaving because I no longer needed to stay. I didn't leave in a hurry. That was the first difference I noticed. For most of my life, exits had been strategic, quiet, apologetic. Tonight, my steps were unremarkable because they didn't need to be anything else. No one stopped me, no one questioned my right to go. The villa receded behind me as I walked down the drive, its lights still glowing, still beautiful, still convincing to anyone who didn't know better. I realized then that I would never see it the same way again. Not as a symbol, not as a threat, just as a structure built on decisions that had finally come due. The air outside the gate felt cooler, cleaner. I paused for a moment, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to mark the transition. There are moments in life that don't announce themselves as endings until you step fully beyond them. This was one of those moments. I drove home slowly, letting the quiet stretch. I thought about how many times I had left family gatherings feeling smaller than when I arrived, replaying conversations in my head, wondering what I could have said differently, how I could have made myself easier to accept. Tonight there was nothing to replay, no arguments, no sharp words, just a clean, undeniable shift. When I reached my house, I sat in the car with the engine off, listening to the ordinary sounds of the neighborhood. A distant dog barking, wind in the trees, someone closing a door down the street. Life continuing, uninterested in drama, steady and indifferent in the best possible way. Inside, I moved through familiar rooms without turning on extra lights. I didn't need them. This space had never required performance. Every object in it had been chosen deliberately, for comfort, for use, for pleasure that didn't need validation. I set my keys down and felt a sense of alignment settle in my body, the kind that comes when something internal finally clicks into place. For the first time, I allowed myself to look back, not at the evening itself, but at the years that had led to it. The quiet accommodations, the swallowed objections, the careful self-editing. I saw them now not as failures, but as survival, as learning, as preparation. What changed tonight wasn't my family. They were always going to be who they were. What changed was my position in relation to them. I was no longer waiting for permission to exist fully. I was no longer measuring myself against a story that required my diminishment to function. I realized something else then, something unexpectedly gentle. I didn't need them to understand what had happened. Understanding was no longer the goal. Awareness had done its work. The rest was theirs to carry. My phone buzzed softly on the counter. I didn't look at it right away. There would be messages, questions, attempts to reframe, to soften, to reclaim ground. They could wait. Tonight was not for managing anyone else's discomfort. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window, watching my reflection merge with the dark outside. I looked the same as I always had. No crown, no spotlight. Just a woman who had finally stepped out of a role she was never meant to play. There is a particular kind of power that comes from no longer needing to be witnessed. It's quiet. It doesn't argue. It doesn't prove. It simply is. That was the power I carried with me now, heavier and steadier than any validation I had ever chased. I thought about my father, my mother, my brother, each of them standing in a space where the rules had changed without their consent. I didn't wish them harm. I didn't wish them clarity. I wished myself freedom. And I had it. If you've ever been told to know your place, especially by the people who were supposed to protect you, I hope you hear this clearly. Your place is not where they put you. It's where you choose to stand when you stop asking for approval. You don't need a dramatic confrontation. You don't need to win an argument. Sometimes the most complete ending comes when you simply outgrow the room and leave it behind. If this story stirred something in you, if it echoed an experience you've carried quietly for years, I invite you to share it. Leave a comment. Read someone else's words. There is strength in recognizing yourself in another woman's silence. And if you want to stay with this channel for more stories about dignity, delayed justice, and the long arc of self-respect, consider subscribing. These stories aren't about revenge for its own sake. They're about reclaiming what should never have been taken. That night didn't make me powerful. It revealed that I had been powerful all along. And finally I knew it for myself.